The sandy beaches of Normandy. It was here that a massive invasion turned the tide of World War II.
The landing barges are stopped by concrete obstacles built far out in the water by the enemy.
But how were more than 130,000 soldiers landed successfully? It was largely down to an elaborate web of deception. Deception has always played an important part in war. Think back to the story of the Trojan horse, perhaps the first well-known deception operation. The myth describes how Greek soldiers were able to take the city of Troy by hiding in a giant wooden horse.
Generally in warfare, the art of deception is absolutely crucial to the success of operations. It's said that in wartime, truth is so precious that it needs to be protected by a bodyguard of lies.
And D-Day certainly was. Operation Fortitude was the deception plan to divert Axis attention away from the real landing site. For these men journeying towards the beaches on the 6th of June 1944, success hinged on secrecy and surprise. An elaborate plan was put in place to deceive the Germans, but it wasn't the first time.
One of the major operations, which was ahead of D-Day, actually took place in the spring of 1943, and this was Operation Mincemeat. And that was essentially to float a dead body off the coast of Spain with fake invasion plans, and the Germans would believe that the invasion was not going to take place in Sicily and Italy, or if it did, it would be a very small affair. But in fact, the main invasion would be Greece and Sardinia. Now, we didn't know if the Germans would buy that, but Operation Mincemeat was such a huge success that in the months after that, the intelligence services started to prepare for D-Day. What kind of deceptions could we do ahead of D-Day and even closer to D-Day? And could we pull it off? Operation Mincemeat told us we could pull it off, but could we do it again?
Some of the deceptions around D-Day featured in an exhibition at the Imperial War Museum.
It's actually something I think the Army today still look at as a model deception operation. And I think when we were looking at it, we wanted to feature it because it is such a successful operation. And I think that's because so many different layers of deception are all working and they all come together. And that's what makes it so successful, because it's not just one deception, it's layer upon layer of different types of deception.
So what happened? Operation Fortitude was made up of two main parts, Fortitude North and Fortitude South. North aimed to convince the Germans that the Allied invasion would come via Norway, whilst South planned to convince them it was coming via France at the Pas-de-Calais region.
Different things were done to make that happen. So there were sort of fake army groups set up and established. So, like they were even given their own badges, and communications were sent out to these sort of phantom armies. So that was one thing. So that gave the impression that troops were massing in areas that they weren't.
There were a whole number of deceptions which emerged, including creating inflatable tanks and having them near airfields or particular areas in the south of England, particularly in Kent. And again, if German reconnaissance aircraft flew over, or they had a spy on the ground that we hadn't picked up, they would see this mass. And the tanks look so real, particularly from the air. So the Germans bought that. They really believed that we were amassing our troops in Kent, ready for an invasion at the Pas-de-Calais, which is south of Dover.
Even the King was on board with that. George VI visited the fake installations at Dover to give credibility to the false intelligence.
But apart from that, we also had an ongoing deception plan with double agents, both men and women. And this was part of what was called the double cross system, and many of us have heard of the feats of Garbo, double agent Garbo, ahead of D-Day. But all of this was so necessary so that the Germans would be looking in the wrong direction.
I think it was just an extraordinary operation. If you've been to the new British D-Day Memorial on the Normandy coast and just walk the defences that were there on the cliffs, take my hat off. Absolutely a mega operation, and extraordinary that we pulled it off.
John Kirby was involved in a less well-known but equally daring deception plan back in 1991 in Iraq, and electronic communications were central to taking Saddam Hussein and his forces by surprise.
The problem was that everybody knew that wherever the Brits were was going to be the point of main effort. The whole of the divisional deception plan then was to make sure that the Iraqis did not know where the Brits were going to be. Now, there are two problems here. One is that all the American radios tuned to 0.5 megahertz. The British radios could tune to 1/4 megahertz. The only other radios in the Gulf that could do the 0.25 were sold to the Brits, to the Kuwaitis, and they were now in Saddam's possession. So I had to suggest that we should never be seen on our radios to be going to the west. And so when we exercised, when we went east, we radiated on full radio power. And then when we came back west again, we went on radio silence. And we set up the scenario that we were actually going to be deploying where we originally deployed in the east.
And to add to this, US General Schwarzkopf, the director of the coalition military campaign, made very public visits to Marine amphibious units. Like King George VI during World War II, this helped reinforce the Iraqi belief that the main effort of the Allied offensive would come from a seaborne assault on the Kuwaiti coast. It all came together. Operation Desert Storm lasted just 100 hours. Operation Fortitude, like the Desert Storm deception, was a resounding success. German High Command were misled about the timing and location of the Allied invasion.
In actual fact, the deception against Nazi Germany was beginning right from the outset of the Second World War in September 1939. There were a whole raft of deceptions, intelligence operations going on that laid the foundations in the run-up to D-Day. But there's no question that that deception, those operations immediately before D-Day, were by far amongst the greatest the Allies ever pulled off in the wartime.
Claire Sadler, Forces News. Thanks for watching. For more from Forces News, like and subscribe to our channel.